Sports Talk Chicago. Remember, Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's a Forbes sports writer, PBWAA member, and a best-selling author. Please welcome Bill Rogers to the program. Bill, it's great to have you on. How are you?
John, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
So, Bill, what's your reaction to the baseball lockout, first off?
Not surprised at all. I mean, I think if you've been following the tea leaves at all, you could see this coming 2 or 3 years ago. And I think it's as simple as take coronavirus out of the picture because it complicates it. But revenues have been going up, and the average player salary going down for a period of the last 4 or 5 years. It predated COVID. The union not really happy with the deals they made the last couple of times that have allowed the economics to flip around. So I think the pendulum has swung far to the owner's side now, and we're going to see the players dug in to get a correction. So I could see it coming. I hope it ends before spring training. I'm not that optimistic.
Why are you not optimistic? What's the main point of contention right now?
Well, I mean, I think it's overall, it's always the money, and I think, we have the owners that have, enjoy the prosperity they have. Not many of those owners, Jerry Reinsdorf would be an exception, have been in the baseball business long enough to have remembered when the power in these negotiations lay on the union side with Donald Fear, Marvin Miller before him. But, I think once you have control, once you have a system that is working well for you, you don't want to let it go. And I think that's what we saw over and over from the player side before we had the 94-95 strike, cost a World Series in 94. I don't know that things will be that bad this year, but I wouldn't necessarily count on a 162 game season because where the sides are now, they're a long way apart. And there's really not that much economic pressure. Although I will say it's different now that teams like the Cubs, for instance, can draw 15,000 people to a spring training game. Usually, spring training is kind of not a big deal because all the broadcast contracts and the season ticket holders' revenues really don't kick in till opening day. So I think we're going to see a lot of posturing. I don't know what's going to happen in spring training. Maybe you can have a spring training with your minor league players without the big leaguers there. I'm not sure. But I'm reasonably concerned. I think the union is really dug in, and the owners are going to have to make some concessions that I don't know that they will want to. And we're really talking both ends of the scale. We're talking about maybe shorter free agency that gives the best players more options. And I think where we really should be focusing is the bottom end of the scale, whether that's with, I wouldn't be surprised if the major league minimum salary, would almost double at the end of this negotiation. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some kind of a system put in for players to get paid when they're put on the 40-man roster. They're still minor leaguers. But we've seen Major League Baseball contract the minor leagues, and they've kind of said it's about the top players. It's not about the volume of players. So then I think they've got to do a better job of taking care of the top players. We did see the housing situation, not small, where Major League Baseball agreed to provide housing for minor leaguers. So I think this negotiation is going to be about that as well. But ultimately, every baseball negotiation since the mid 70s winds up being about free agency, arbitration, and those top end pistons that kind of drive the economic system.
What do you think is correct when it comes to free agency? What kind of policy would you like to see put in place?
I don't really see big reasons to overhaul any of it. But I think Major League Baseball has to find a way to make, and the easiest way, and other sports figured this out a long time ago, is a salary cap where you tie revenues to salaries. Baseball owners it's always been anathema to them. They would never agree to a salary cap. And I think, it depends on who's doing the calculations, but you should probably have about a 50% split in revenues between ownership and players. And now I think that has swung back around where players are probably closer to 45%. So I think something that addresses, and this is these negotiations are really odd because there could have been a minimum payroll floor put in as far back as 2002. It's been offered by owners and not talking about $25 million. I think the last in the 2002 negotiations, I think owners were offering a floor of around 60 or 70 million, which is
Wow.
probably the same numbers we see quote unquote rebuilding clubs spending less than that now. And the guys that have been hurt have been the mid-level guys that wind up being replaced by young prospects, and it's having to sign minor league deals themselves after 4 or 5 non-spectacular but years when they contributed in the major leagues. They were talking about major league players, and ultimately there's not enough jobs for those guys, and a minimum floor would address that. But players, the union has always felt like, union lawyers have always felt like, if you put a floor on salaries, it's going to make it easier for the owners to get the salary cap. And that's just been a thing that the players union would never agree to.
Do you see any changes coming to the game itself, like universal DH or 7-inning doubleheaders becoming permanent, things like that?
I think the DH is inevitable. I don't think there's much opposition in the National League to it now. I think they've realized, National League ownership, front offices, that it's much easier to build a team, to construct a roster with a DH than it it offsets the tradition. I don't know that the fans of National League teams are as opposed to it as they have been. I think the interleague play has certainly muddled it, where you've seen National League teams playing at American League parks with DHs. I'm working on an off-season, a 2022 preview magazine, and in it we list likely starters for every position, and we're including a National League DH. I think we'll have a line in there that says it hadn't yet been agreed to, but it's expected to be when the CBA is finalized. So that one I think's for sure. I don't know about, I wouldn't expect 7-inning doubleheaders. I wouldn't expect runners starting on bases unless that rule was maybe pushed back and you made it in the 14th inning, the 13th inning, something like that. Maybe there's a point where it's acceptable to get a conclusion. I actually have enjoyed that. I think it's exciting baseball. And it keeps you watching the late night West Coast games when you might tune out if it was 3-3 going to the 10th. So I've kind of liked that. But I'd be surprised if those, because I don't think there's anybody pushing those. Like, it's not a big deal with the players, and I don't think it's really a big deal with the owners. Time of game's a big deal. The pitch clock has worked in the minor leagues. The technology puts the robot umpire in play to be talked about. I would always vote the under over the over in terms of radical change in baseball. So, I could see a shot clock. I couldn't really see a robot umpire calling balls and strikes, but I think clearly we're heading toward it. But I think this time around, this is not unlike, to me, 94, 95. People say owners didn't care about steroids in the sport. In that bargaining session, owners pushed for a testing system, and the players, said, no, thanks, we're not interested in it. And ultimately it became about the economics of the sport, which is really what these talks are always about. And I think similar this time, you've heard all this talk about rule changes, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to be about the economics of the sport, and we're not going to see a lot of the theoretical changes put into play.
Bill Rogers here on Sports Talk Chicago. Bill, what do you make of your Hall of Fame ballot?
Well, as usual, I doubt it pleased very many people. should be the last time I get to not vote for Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, which will be a good thing. I think Mark McGwire was the first guy really tied to the PEDs that came on the ballot. And when he came on the ballot, if my recollection is correct, that it was McGwire, I had to ask myself, how am I going to deal with this? And I think, unlike a lot of other voters, newer voters, I looked at the guidelines for voting. I'd always looked at it. And there's the sportsmanship, character, integrity clause that you're to consider. And in my lifetime, I don't think anything has damaged the credibility, the integrity of baseball more than the widespread use of PEDs. So I made the decision then, I'm going to follow these guidelines strictly, and I'm not going to vote for these guys. So it's always been a fairly easy choice for me to stick with, but it never a popular choice. I've been surprised, I could almost say over the decades, but let's just say the last decade, I've been surprised by how many journalists and fellow voters I really respect blow right past that clause and vote for Bonds and Clemens and others, but I've not been able to. Now this year's ballot, and I saw that this also you could see coming, was David Ortiz. He had a according to the New York Times, he was included in that bunch of tests in 2003, which honestly we should know about. It was an anonymous round of testing, but the union did a poor job they were late getting those tests destroyed. And as a result, federal government seized the records. And there was a leak for 5 or 6 years of the names coming out that were tied to that. And in 2009, I think it was, David Ortiz was tied to that. But there's nuance to Ortiz beyond the other people that were reported to have had positive tests on that list. Sammy Sosa for one. David Ortiz pushed back strongly, and a news conference was held a couple days after that report, within a week of that report, at Yankee Stadium, where Michael Weiner, then the head of the Players Union, sat next to David Ortiz, let David Ortiz make his case. Major League Baseball issued a statement basically saying that David Ortiz, we don't know about David Ortiz, and basically saying it could have been supplements, like he said. There were more, the federal government seized more tests than there were positives on that round of testing. I think there were 96 reported positives, and the Fed seized 103, 105 of those tests and preserved them. And David Ortiz was one of them. And every player had the opportunity to kind of do that. And it always struck me as it was a real strong showing that Michael Weiner, who I had huge respect for, would go out there and while privately the union would defend other players from it, they never made a public showing like they made for David Ortiz. And people will say and are saying that people are voting for David Ortiz because he's popular and, people like him. I don't especially like David Ortiz. I respect him. I respect the way at the end of his career, he lost 30 to 40 pounds and gained about 5 years as a productive player because he addressed his issues. From 2004 till the end of his career, he was tested, never tested positive. And I just find the nuance in the way he defended himself creates a level of doubt. My thing's always been, I can't, I can't assume what I don't know, and I can't ignore what I do know, and with Barry Bonds, you had all the Balco rage, you had all of that firm documentation, if not a positive test. But with, a lot of guys, it's really, really tough. I mean, writers shouldn't be in the position to figure that out because we don't know. Nobody really knows. I think some other players know, but the one thing, and people will bring up amphetamines, that there were players from other generations that used greenies to play day games after night games, et cetera. But those players used those things openly. They were in clubhouses. They didn't hide it. But the PED guys, they pretty much hid what they were doing. Unless you got in a Jose Canseco book, you weren't likely to be outed by other players because you were doing it at home or in somebody else's gym. You weren't sitting there in front of your locker with all your PEDs out. And, to me, that showed me that these guys that did it knew they were doing wrong. And, so I can't ever get around the character, sportsmanship, integrity clause that, I wish it wasn't on the ballot. I wish the Hall of Fame had given us directives for how they wanted us to handle those guys. But the guidelines for voting haven't been changed since the 1960s. So I think the Hall likes the controversy, and I don't think they want the PED guys in. And sports writers, baseball writers like myself have provided that line of defense. So we'll see what happens when it starts to get to the other Hall of Fame committees, when the players go off the ballots and it gets to the era committees, and that'll happen fast, and we'll see. I don't have much more optimism. I think we've seen the Hall of Famers, are kind of a hanging jury. I think they're harder than the BBWAA voters. So I wouldn't put a lot of stock in getting in through those committees if I was one of these guys.
What's the purpose of the Hall of Fame deal?
Recognize the best of the best, celebrate the game, it's an awesome place to visit, and inductions are terrific. But if it's a crowded induction, I would almost say if you're going to make one visit in your lifetime, don't go on induction weekend, because there's a lot of things you can't do because of the crowds. And it's just a great place to wander around when it's not an induction weekend. But the Hall has an amazing resource library. If you played one day in the major leagues, you will have a file folder with newspaper stories, now online presence to represent your career. And that's a good resource for families whose uncle played in the big leagues. You can go look up stuff and you'll learn stuff that you didn't know. The Hall does a fabulous job.
So let me ask you this then, because you mentioned it's about honoring the history of the game. Do you think you could ever come around to the fact that these steroid users were historic parts of the game? So maybe you'd vote for them in the future.
I would have voted for him 8 years ago if the Hall of Fame had provided new, different guidance and guidelines for the voters. Could Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, those guys be in there? Yes. Could Roger Clemens, for instance, Clemens, this gets lost, but he got in. Major League Baseball policed itself. He was in the Mitchell report. Before that, he had a clean record. Whatever he had done, he had not been caught doing it. But he was all over the Mitchell report for his PED use. And so should that be on his plaque? I think yes, that should probably be on his plaque. It should, if Barry Bonds gets in someday, it should probably be on his plaque. That his personal trainer went to jail 3 times rather than testifying what exactly he was doing in the off seasons. So yeah, I think a complete history, and I think it's up to the Hall of Fame as an institution. They have the right to decide, the guideline of the voting and that. And as a voter, I've tried to follow their guidelines. Now, clearly there are a lot of other voters that, look at it differently, but I've tried to be consistent since I started with that first McGwire vote.
Why do you only vote for 4 guys?
Well, I voted for more. I voted, if you go back and look, I'm pretty sure I voted for 7 and 8. I've never really thought you needed 10. It's a high standard to be a Hall of Famer. And, I'm not exactly sure who more I should have voted for. This year I voted for Curt Schilling with reservations, but what he's done to bring scorn on himself really is his behavior and his attitudes and his comments since he stopped playing. To me, you're voting on a guy as, the extent of his career. So I voted for him every time he's been on the ballot. I voted for Scott Rowland. Just started last year, I think. I missed him his first year on the ballot, and I went back and I took another look, and I decided, this guy deserves to be on the ballot. I voted for David Ortiz, and I vote for Mark Buehrle, which a lot of people think I vote for Buehrle because I like him. I do like him. He's a great guy. But if you look, and you can play this game with a lot of Hall of Famers, compare him to other people in the Hall of Fame. If you look at his win total, his ERA, he's pretty close to Roy Halladay. He doesn't have the strikeouts Roy Halladay had. He's a different kind of a pitcher. To me, even when he was pitching, I always thought he was like Jim Cott, if not Whitey Ford. Now we've seen Jim Cott get in the Hall of Fame. If you look at Mark's 6 best years, they're better than Jim Cott's 6 best years. And I'm a backer of Jim Cott. I don't say that to knock him. So, and I did go back. I look at it every year. I'm not bound by my past ballots. So I went back and I took another hard look at Mark, and I concluded he's a special kind of a pitcher. He wasn't a strikeout pitcher. The Hall of Fame definitely favors strikeout pitchers, but not, I think guys, Greg Maddux later in his career, at the first of his career, he was a strikeout pitcher, and then he kind of evolved into this master. But Mark Buehrle, John, I'm going to ask you a quick question here. He pitched 30 innings in the postseason. How many guys did he walk?
I would guess 2.
1, and it was Manny Ramirez intentional walk. And so these are the best lineups, and he would go out fearlessly and throw strikes and challenge hitters, fielded his position like Jim Cott did, won the Gold Gloves, worked the quick games. And I think like Roy Halladay, Mark wasn't a Tommy John guy, and Mark also wasn't a guy who ever let you know when he wasn't hurt. But in his era, nobody made 30 starts a year and 200 plus innings a year more than Mark Buehrle did. He did it for like 14 years in a row. He didn't feel great all those times. In fact, his shoulder killed him. The reason he basically had to stop pitching was there's a limit to how many cortisone shots you can get in a shoulder in a season. And he basically got quoted out of cortisone shots in his shoulder and just didn't have, enough of the regular muscles and tendons. And he had too much inflammation to pitch until he was 40. I thought he could be like Whitey Ford or Cott and pitch effectively into his 40s, because he was still effective at the very end of his career after the White Sox had stupidly kept John Danks and let him go, and he signed the contract with the Marlins and was traded to Toronto. Like the White Sox, a tough ballpark to pitch in. And, he never once complained about cheap home runs at US Cellular, where it gave up a lot, especially the left-handed pitchers. That it wasn't a high fly ball to left field was likely a home run for most of the time that Mark pitched there. And, he never complained about anything. He was as professional as you could be. He came up big in the postseason in the biggest of games. So, he's a tough call because he doesn't have 290 wins. He just got over 200. But, if you look at his ERAs, you look at ERA plus, for a guy that wasn't a strikeout pitcher, he did it as well as it could be done.
What do you say to those who criticize your ballot? I know there's been a lot of fanfare since you put it out on Twitter earlier today.
Welcome to the club, I guess. I don't know. I don't like it. I would love it if 98% of people said, wow, what a great ballot. This guy's the smartest of his generation. Everybody would like that kind of affirmation. But I feel like, I respect my own opinion if other people choose not to. I saw these guys play. I got to know many of them. I was boots on the ground at the ballpark, where now even many Hall of Fame voters, saw the game from TV and on the internet. They weren't at the ballpark. They didn't talk to the old time scouts and managers and really get to know what people inside the game thought about other people inside the game. When I started covering baseball in the 80s, it was inevitable that you would be around and you'd get that knowledge just by being there, boots on the ground. And, so I would say, anybody that has a different opinion is entitled to it. But that's, I, I know what I know. I think what I know, and I follow that when I get it. When I'm asked by the Hall of Fame to use that knowledge, I do it.
Were there any close calls? People you thought about voting for but ended up not doing so?
Yeah, I went back and I looked, and Twitter does drive a lot of this, and I'm fairly active on Twitter, maybe more than I should be. Um, but there are people, Ozzie Guillen Jr., who I've known since he was a teenager. Um, it is very loud advocate for certain players. Andrew Jones is one, Bobby Abreu is another. And Abreu, I really didn't think about when he first came on the ballot. So I went back and I looked at it, and he has like a lot of OPS is terrific. He has a lot of metrics that stack up, but Junior, as I call Ozzie Jr., was comparing him to Tony Gwynn. So I thought, I got to take a look at this and see where he's coming from. And if you look at just the slash line stats, you can kind of see that. But Bobby Abreu had a great eye at the plate, a lot of discipline, and walked a ton. Like his hits don't compare at all to Tony Gwynn. I think Abreu made 2 All-Star teams in his career and was never like high on an MVP ballot. Gwynn won 8 batting titles, sort of a different guy. But I did take a hard look at him. I've taken through the years a hard look at Andrew Jones. There are always guys that are really, really great players. But Paul Konerko was one. I mean, there are guys that have great careers, but they just come up a little bit short. I did not vote for Fred McGriff when he's on the ballot. You hear a lot of Fred McGriff talk. The magic numbers were really big when he first got on the ballot. 500 homers, 3,000 hits, and he came up short. He played a long time at the end of his career and was a shell of himself. At the start of his career, is an unbelievable player. But it's funny that Carlton Fisk is a guy that got in the Hall of Fame by playing into his 40s. The stamina, the durability, longevity of his career, I think probably got him in the Hall of Fame over a guy like Thurman Munson, who unfortunately didn't have a chance to have that. When you start comparing guys like that, and Jim Cott, the longevity, I think, clearly got him in. But it's funny when you see these guys, like I saw Carlton Fisk play quite a bit at the end of his career, kind of a shell of himself, and that's, you set such a high standard, it's tough to keep living up to it. And that certainly happened to Fred McGriff. Unfortunately for Fred McGriff, I saw him play for the Cubs, up close, and he didn't have much left. And, you see that stuff, it stays with you. It's kind of hard to get it out of your head. I mean, I know he was an unbelievably good player at the start of his career. I know he's a good defensive first baseman, not just a one-tool guy. But the standard is super high, and it's supposed to be. I think at the end of the day, despite all the gnashing of teeth, the baseball writers do a pretty good job of electing who should be elected, and being able as a group to say no to other people that just had great careers. I think the standard 75%. I mean, I say this every year, but nobody's ever given me another election where you need a higher standard. I'm not sure about the Roman Catholic Church and the Pope. When the white smoke comes out of the Vatican, I'm not sure what the standard of all the cardinals was when they voted. But 75%. And more now than ever because social media and whatever else has really polarized society more than it was. And, I've always really respected that 75% threshold. And I never really cared if anybody got 100%. If, I know this year there've been some blank ballots mailed in. I don't think I would ever do that. I mean, that's the ultimate old sourpuss move. But for every no vote, you got to get 3 yes votes. So it's really, really hard to get past that 75% standard.
Phil Rogers, still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Phil, a few more questions before we finish up. First off, is it true you covered Sammy Sosa's debut?
I did. Thanks for asking, John. I was working for the Dallas Times Herald, which was the first newspaper that I covered baseball for. And he debuted at Yankee Stadium. He played center field and batted leadoff. And he was a highly regarded prospect, but he was spoken of as a future batting champion, not a power hitter. I mean, they thought this guy is going to, hit the ball all around the park, use his speed to really be a super. I didn't hear one word about, they probably would have thought he's going to hit 15 to 20 homers, whatever you could do without being like a true power hitter, but really the excitement for him was about, the dynamic bat and the speed, and unbelievable arm. They loved him as a prospect and they got him to the big leagues early. He played both ends of a doubleheader at Yankee Stadium his first day, and I was covering it.
How funny is it today to know that he wasn't a all-around hitter, turned into a power hitter?
Not funny, but when I covered more American League than National League as a beat guy, and so when a player was, I saw the American League players 10 games a year, sitting there in front of me if I'm paying any attention at all, but not so much the National League. So I've always known I had a little blind spot for the National League. But Sammy, after Texas made a horrendous trade and traded him to the White Sox, and the White Sox traded him to the Cubs, and another probably horrendous trade, although it served a purpose at the time. I kind of lost a little track of Sammy. But I moved from the Dallas Morning News to the Chicago Tribune in '97. I was covering the White Sox. It was the first year of interleague play. And so I didn't cover every game. I'd go to a few Cub games. I saw him. The first time I walked into the clubhouse, I basically almost didn't recognize him because like body type, everything did not look at all like the kid I had seen make the debut. But in fairness, he was a teenager when he made his debut. And, he had gone through some changes, but just like facially and everything, I never really quite recognized him. And that I had that experience with other players where they would leave a team I had covered, go someplace else. I would walk into the clubhouse and I would look at the guy, and he looked totally different than the guy or not totally different, but he looked really changed from the guy that I knew. And so I definitely had that experience the first time I saw Sammy. I saw him a lot in '98, although I actually wound up covering, I think I saw McGuire's last 15 home runs in that home run race. Paul Sullivan was doing kind of the daily Sammy, and I was doing the daily Mark. The Chicago Tribune, great resources in that era. And we were aggressive in being places. People can say we weren't aggressive in not reporting the PED use, but believe me, if we had reported it, if we knew it, we would have, it would have been in the newspaper. But that wasn't, I think we found over the years that if you lack subpoena power, it was kind of hard to get to the bottom of that story.
Phil, before we finish up today, last question: who's the greatest player you've ever seen play?
Well, this is, Nolan Ryan is the best at what he did that I ever saw play. And I saw him pitch until he was 46. I got to know him pretty well. I got to see how hard he worked, how smart he was. I was on Twitter that recently there was a video that circulated of Nolan pitching, and he was wearing the most god awful um, purple and gold sweatsuit. And Tom House, who then was the Texas Rangers pitching coach, was out there. And then there was a tall guy standing next to him asking questions. That was Randy Johnson. And House got in trouble with the Texas Rangers because he and Nolan kind of befriended Randy Johnson when he couldn't throw a strike. He had gone from Montreal to Seattle, and he was incredibly hot and cold, and he hadn't figured it out. And I think they worked with him a fair amount of times and helped Randy Johnson figure it out. So it was kind of fun to go back and see that video. But Nolan's approach, and he's what I also found out is through the years, Konerko's another example, Buehrle's an example, is like the best players are really often the best guys. And Nolan would get really annoyed that young pitchers would on his teammates would not come up to him and ask for advice. I think they were intimidated, but he didn't feel like it was his role to go over and say, "Hey, I noticed this last night." He would wait for guys to come ask him, and guys wouldn't come ask him. But so being around him, watching up close what he did in the second half of his career was really a lot of fun.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for joining me. Always a pleasure to talk with you. Best wishes there on Twitter when that Hall of Fame ballot keeps going out. But I really appreciate the time and looking forward to when we talk next.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.